They looked like the dream team of 1960s television, Elizabeth Montgomery and Dick York, enchanting millions as the magical couple on Bewitched. But behind the smiles and spells was a deep rift that no one saw coming. One day, York was gone. No farewell, no explanation, just silence. And Montgomery? She never mentioned his name again. What really happened between these two stars? Why did she cut him out of her life so completely? This isn't just a story about a TV show, it's about betrayal, pain, and the moment everything changed forever. For years, the truth remained buried beneath studio silence and nostalgic memories. What could cause Elizabeth Montgomery to draw such a hard line, to never work with Dick York again and erase him from her life completely? The answer, long hidden, is far more tragic than fans ever imagined. When Bewitched premiered in 1964, it felt like lightning in a bottle. The premise of a lovely suburban witch concealing her powers for the sake of her mortal husband was whimsical and fresh. But what truly captured hearts was the undeniable spark between its stars, Elizabeth Montgomery and Dick York. Montgomery, the daughter of Hollywood icon Robert Montgomery, was no stranger to the spotlight. Known for playing clever, elegant women with an air of mystery, she brought a magnetic presence to the screen that elevated everything she touched. But even her star power couldn't hide the storm brewing behind the scenes. When Elizabeth Montgomery stepped into the role of Samantha Stevens, she didn't just play a witch, she redefined the image of a television heroine. With grace, intelligence, and effortless charm, she captured the hearts of viewers and brought a sense of sophistication to suburban magic. Opposite her, Dick York brought Darren Stevens to life with a perfect blend of wit and vulnerability. A seasoned actor with roots in radio, stage, and television drama, York possessed a rare authenticity. His reactions to Samantha's spells weren't just funny, they were human. He radiated a kind of warmth that made audiences feel like they knew him. In the beginning, the Bewitched set was electric with energy and excitement. The chemistry between Montgomery and York was unmistakable, playful, sharp, and filled with natural rhythm. Though Montgomery was happily married to producer William Asher, her on-screen rapport with York was genuine. There were no romantic entanglements, only mutual respect and an easy camaraderie that made every scene sparkle. But beneath the laughter and the applause, shadows were forming, cracks in the foundation that would eventually tear the magic apart. Co-stars remembered them easily bouncing off one another and laughing together in between takes. On TV, their unspoken beat was evident. Bewitched was a huge hit in those initial seasons. Both York and Montgomery received high marks from critics for their performances, and it regularly placed close to the top of the ratings. Samantha's soft humor and Darren's frustrated responses looked natural. However, the magic that occurs on screen is rarely permanent. Things behind the scenes gradually started to change even as the cameras recorded humorous, light-hearted moments. Something was going on below the surface. At first, only a select few sensed the subtle strain. On film, Dick York's smile never wavered, but in reality, he was starting to feel the weight of something considerably heavier. Furthermore, Elizabeth Montgomery did not readily accept weakness, even though she came across as kind in public. Dick York was fighting a ghost that followed him around every step of the way long before he even stepped foot on the Bewitched set. His life was altered by a single incident in 1959 while he was filming the Western drama They Came to Cordura. York and a number of other people were driving a handcar, the type used to manually push rail lines, in a physically taxing setting. The heavy metal handle swung back violently when one of the team members lost hold, crashing viciously into York's spine. Later on, he said, "I felt like there was an explosion inside my back." The harm was instantaneous. His spine had a torn muscle, and the effects lasted a lifetime. York persisted instead of seeking long-term care or taking a break. Actors were expected to endure chronic agony throughout that time period. A cycle of painkillers, chiropractic adjustments, and sheer resolve began for him. He was already living in a precarious equilibrium, silently coping with his suffering, when he was cast and Bewitched a few years later. However, That delicate balancing act would soon become practically impossible due to the demands of a popular television program. Few people noticed in the beginning. Even when his back was screaming in pain, York had a remarkable capacity to look happy and intelligent. He would film his scenes with comedy and enthusiasm, then slump into a chair between takes, sweating profusely. In order to allow him to lie down in between scenes, stage crews started having folding seats close by. In order to reduce his physical movement, scripts were revised. In order to conceal the fact that York frequently supported himself by bracing himself against furniture, directors skillfully angled the camera. At first, Montgomery was accommodated by the production crew, which was headed by William Asher, Montgomery's husband. They gave him time to recuperate, rearranged the filming schedule, and urged him to get any assistance he required. However, under pressure, the luxury of waiting wears out, and television moves quickly. York started to accrue missed days. There were times when he was just too ill to come in. On other occasions, he showed up but was unable to finish a scene. York remained warm throughout it all. Even when the agony got intolerable, he didn't complain and continued to be courteous to everyone on set. But others, particularly Elizabeth Montgomery, started to feel the effects of his battle. She first expressed sympathy, but by season 4, her tone had shifted. She started to remove herself from York, according to several crew reports. Their once playful exuberance became chilly. Some claim that the frequent schedule changes annoyed her. Some people think she thought York's illness was taking too much focus away from the other actors. Her patience looked to be wearing thin, for whatever reason. Additionally, the mood on set grew colder as York's body failed more frequently. However, that was only the start of what would turn out to be one of the most devastating divisions in classic television. The fissures behind the scenes had begun to develop by the 4th season of Bewitched. What had started out as a friendly workplace had turned tense. Every day on set became a mental and physical struggle for Dick York. His failing health, the demanding shooting schedule, and the pressure to perform all combined to produce an underlying frustration that was impossible to conceal with any amount of film wizardry. Once friendly and involved with York, Elizabeth Montgomery had become notably aloof. She had a reputation for being professional, dedicated, focused, and committed to maintaining the show's seamless operation. However, her tone changed, according to people close to the production. She frequently stayed to herself rather than smiling or cracking a joke between takes to greet York. Some hypothesized that she was emotionally separating herself to shield herself from the everyday turbulence that had started to characterize the charmed set as a coping mechanism. Some were less giving. There were rumors that York's absences and on-set difficulties had annoyed Montgomery. According to others, she felt constrained by the frequent rewrites and reshoots. Her husband, executive producer of the show, William Asher, also had an impact. Asher, who was known for his tough demeanor, allegedly had several arguments with York. His main goals were to maintain the show's profitability, efficiency, and tightness. And York's erratic health was starting to get in the way of that objective. According to one former crew member, York once requested a brief break before filming a challenging part because he was clearly worn out and writhing in agony. According to reports, Asher rolled his eyes and left the set. Such moments conveyed a very obvious message. York has a limited amount of time left with the show. Although Montgomery never voiced any grievances in public, her quiet was quite telling. Personal interactions had decreased, and the camaraderie that characterized the early days had vanished. Although they had shared sequences on camera, their relationship had soured off camera. There was tension in the air even when York gave passionate performances, even enduring excruciating agony to do so. On certain days, you could feel it between takes because it was that thick. York kept showing up in spite of everything, frequently defying the doctor's orders. He was no longer the laid-back, vivacious co-star from season 1, but he truly liked the part and believed in the show. He was altered by the anguish. His look, his movements, and the fact that he now hardly ever smiled off-screen were all signs of pressure. Elizabeth was also changed by the combined strain of a difficult marriage to the show's boss and a high-pressure production. Their formerly sincere bond had deteriorated into something aloof, formal, and protective. Then the day came when that increasing separation became irrevocable. While season 5 was being filmed, the event that altered everything occurred. Even though he was hardly able to walk, Dick York had been dragging himself to the set for months, barely surviving. His body finally failed on a specific day in 1969. They were recording a straightforward scene, nothing unusual, in front of the entire cast and crew. York was delivering lines as Darren Stevens in the kitchen set when he abruptly became pale and began to sway. Then suddenly he fell to the ground. The team hurried in. Production ceased. There was a period of total silence in the studio. All that happened was that he was sent to the hospital. He never made it back to the Bewitched set. Official pronouncements lacked specificity. Health issues were the studio's excuse, but the truth was more nuanced. York himself stated that he wanted to return. Later, he said that he pleaded with the producers for a few weeks off so that he could recuperate and assured them that he could complete the season. However, that call never materialized. Days later, however, the studio revealed that Dick Sargent would be replacing him as Darren Stevens, a drastically altered portrayal of the character that many fans never came to terms with. There was no farewell episode or on-screen justification for the transition. As though he had never been there, York just vanished from the series. The quiet was even more painful as the abrupt replacement. Elizabeth Montgomery never made contact. No note, no letter, no visit. Their collaboration ended silently after 5 years of working side by side. Others perceived something more profound in Montgomery's quiet, while others said it was William Asher's choice to replace York, a clean separation that would allow the show to continue. Was it indifference, guilt, or frustration? Nobody is positive as of yet. Not once did she publicly address York's departure. Dick York was devastated by the abrupt rejection. Even though he had sacrificed a lot for the position, it was ultimately insufficient to win a farewell. There was a lot of conversation behind closed doors. A few members of the cast quietly sympathized with York. Others subtly acknowledged that having someone more physically dependable in the position was a relief. However they felt about it, the message was unmistakable. No one was allowed to discuss York's departure. The switch was startling for the fans. York, however, experienced a personal heartbreak. He had lost his beloved role, been abandoned by his former co-stars, and been severed from a co-star he had admired and possibly even loved. And in the years that followed, Elizabeth Montgomery's quiet would only become more agonizing. Elizabeth Montgomery herself, as well as the producers and media, were utterly silent following Dick York's abrupt exit from Bewitched. The formerly vibrant, albeit complex, working relationship came to an abrupt end. York later said that she never called him, never spoke to him in a nice way, and never even sent him a message. Furthermore, the quiet was not fleeting. For the remainder of their lives, it persisted. York initially made an effort to be hopeful. He continued to speak of Montgomery with admiration and reverence in interviews years afterward. He characterized her as professional, personable, and gifted. He never publicly chastised her. He was careful with his remarks, even when questioned about how their relationship ended. He once remarked, "She went her way and I went mine." However, there was a profound melancholy that persisted behind those remarks. It was a different story behind closed doors. York told close pals that he had made an effort to get in touch. In an attempt to make things right, he sent a letter, possibly several. He never received a response. Those closest to him said the silence was more painful than anything else. It appeared that she had little desire in making amends, despite the many hours they had spent together on set and the early season's fun and joking. Even now, it's still unclear why Montgomery remained silent. Some assume that it was done out of loyalty to William Asher, her former husband, who had apparently grown weary of putting up with York's health problems. According to some, she might have been angry at the disruption York's illness caused to the show's pace, thinking that he was more bother than he was worth. Others, however, question whether the problem was more intimate. In the early years of filming, there were reports that York had fallen in love with Montgomery, but these were never verified. While she married and concentrated on her own path, others speculated that his love for her might have transcended friendship and that she did not return the favor. She might have wanted to remove herself from him after he left the production, if there was an emotional gap. Whatever the cause, the end result was undeniable. York never worked together with her once more, never spoke to her once more, and in no way received any acknowledgement of his departure or his ache. But, remarkably, he never expressed bitterness. Till the stop of his existence, he continued to talk of Montgomery with dignity. However, Elizabeth's silence, even decades later, regarded to talk louder than any phrases. And at the same time as York quietly diminished from the spotlight, the tale of what definitely befell between them, grew extra complicated with every passing year. After Bewitched, Dick York never landed any other position of that scale. Hollywood had a way of forgetting actors who may want to no longer keep tempo, especially those dealing with long-time period fitness troubles. For York, the damage that had haunted him for years best got worse. And without constant paintings or a first-rate help system, his existence took a heartbreaking flip. By using the mid-1970s, he turned into all but retired from acting. The physical ache had grown to be too exceptional, and the gives had stopped coming. He lived in relative obscurity with his spouse Joan, whom he had married lower back in 1952. Via every conflict, she remained with the aid of his side, from time to time actually sporting him whilst he was not able to walk. Their bond became his anchor in a world that no longer had a place for him. The economic pressure hit hard. At one point, York and his spouse had been dwelling on the brink of poverty, relying on minimum residuals and incapacity guide. There had been times after they needed to select among hospital treatment and groceries. He defined the one's years as humbling, but he never expressed resentment. No longer closer to Hollywood, no longer towards Bewitched, and definitely not closer to Elizabeth Bernard Law Montgomery. In truth, notwithstanding the silence between them, York nonetheless cited her with kindness. In one in every of his final interviews, he defined First Viscount Montgomery of Alamine as a cute female and said he was hoping she remembered him fondly. He in no way as soon as retaliated or tried to tarnish her photograph, even if asked at once approximately their estrangement. However, Dick York's legacy took a terrific turn inside the final chapter of his life. Though restricted to his mattress for an awful lot of the 1980s and early 1990s, he used the little energy he needed to make a difference. He based Appearing for Life, a charity agency committed to supporting the homeless. From his small home in Michigan, he made phone calls, coordinated donations, and inspired others to join the purpose. It became an undertaking that gave him purpose, and it kept his spirit alive even as his body persevered to say no. Friends say that even in his weakest moments, he remained constructive, and full of compassion. His voice, nevertheless recognizable to fanatics of Bewitched, had grown softer, but no much less sincere. He by no means gave up wish that in the future the rift between him and Montgomery may heal. That maybe, just maybe, they may reconnect before it turned into too past due. But time ran out. On February 20, 1992, Dick York ended far from complications associated with emphysema. He became 63 years antique. He died in his spouse's hands, a ways from the intense lighting fixtures of Hollywood, some distance from the repute he as soon as knew, and nonetheless estranged from the woman who had shared his most iconic role. But if he carried any bitterness in the one's final days, he in no way showed it. And at the same time as York left quietly, Elizabeth First Viscount Montgomery of Alamine's silence lingered, one that could remain till her own existence came to an unexpected and surprising give-up. Elizabeth First Viscount Montgomery of Alamine's profession endured to flourish after Dick York's departure. But something approximately her demeanor modified. She remained a household call, nevertheless mesmerizing on display screen. Yet, when it got here to the topic of Bewitched, she grew increasingly guarded. For years, she gave interviews about her time on the display, however she never once cited York by way of name. Not in passing, not in mirrored image, no longer even if immediately triggered. To outsiders, it appeared like a planned omission. And for folks that knew how close York had once been to the coronary heart of the series, her silence became puzzling. What ought to have pushed this type of lasting distance among two actors who had once shared a lot screen time, laughter, and accept as true with? Some believed her refusal to talk about York became rooted in guilt, that perhaps she regretted how he were changed, or how little become completed to assist him as his health declined. Others have been certain it came from resentment that she blamed him for the disruption on set for overlooked shoot days, or for compromising the show's production drift. Nevertheless, others' idea it was something a long way extra private, something that by no means made it into the tabloids or behind-scenes specials. There had been whispers from insiders that first Viscount Montgomery of Alamine felt conflicted, that she had favored York, however did not realize the way to cope with his ache, that she had attempted at first to be patient and compassionate. But the mounting strain from her own personal lifestyles, mainly her complicated marriage to William Asher, made her detach as a form of self-protection. In spite of everything, Asher became not simply her husband, he became her boss. His frustrations with York may also have motivated her more than absolutely everyone found out. There is also the opportunity that Sir Bernard Law in reality preferred to avoid revisiting the most hard components of her career. She turned into notoriously non-public, in particular in her later years. She rarely spoke about conflict, choosing as a substitute to consciousness on her charitable paintings, own family, and the legacy of the series as a whole. But nonetheless, her absolute silence on York remained a mystery. Whilst Bernard Law Montgomery herself became unwell in the mid-90s, many wondered if she would in the end wreck that silence, perhaps provide a few reflection or a tribute to the man who had helped release the magic of Bewitched alongside her, however she in no way did. On May additionally 18, 1995, Elizabeth Montgomery passed far away from colon cancer. She became only 62 years old. In her very last interviews, there has been no point out of Dick York, no reconciliation, no very last phrases, just the identical measured silence that had observed her on the grounds that his exit from the show. It changed into the sort of silence that invites questions and leaves solutions buried forever. However, what stays is not simply the absence of words. It's miles the load of what changed into in no way said.